Tom Stone, who's going to be talking to us about all-time dream teams for the 30 franchises. He has a book that's coming out in the next couple weeks. I believe you can pre-order it now on all the usual booksellers. And great topic for a hot stove talk. I know that I've had many debates with this and with the dream teams for the various franchises. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi everyone. Great to be here. This is a group, both the local SABR chapter and the Historical Society, that I think it's been maybe 10 years since I've come to a meeting, and I feel awful about that. Now I'm only coming when I've got a book that I've written myself, but I plan to start coming to more of these meetings whenever I can. My wife is in the back, Cassie, the one with the red hair there. She and I give talks a lot. We're in the corporate training industry and broader human resources industry. So we do a lot of travel, and it just seems like every time I get the emails from Ryan, the next meeting coming up, it's like it's either right before, during, or after one of our trips to speak at conferences and things. So I always seem to miss out, but I'm going to make sure to change that. So like Ryan said, this is a book I've been working on for a long time. A little bit just about me real quick. I grew up in Wheatland. I went to Caledonia Mumford High School. I graduated there in 1991. I went to U of R. I'm pretty much a lifelong Rochesterian. I've been in the learning and development corporate field for about 20 years now. I worked at a company here, L&K, for 12 years, which doesn't exist anymore, but I worked there for a good while. I'm a researcher now at the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're a small HR research firm. As I said, my wife in the back, Cassie, this is actually my first baseball book, but my second published book. She and I co-wrote a book called Interact and Engage. It has a bunch of, if you're familiar with doing webinars online, this book was something sort of a recipe book for how to do webinars and virtual training in a more interactive and engaging way. And we now live in Brighton with our son Wyatt and our two cats. So that's just a little bit about me. One other little factoid about me is, like I said, I graduated from Calamum High School in 1991, and there I am getting my diploma, and you see this handsome gentleman here is none other than Kurt Smith, who gave the convocation at my high school graduation in 1991.
Usually he needs a haircut.
He looks a little bit like a super agent spy or something. Little Robert Redford going on there with the blonde hair. He didn't know I was going to share this photo. So anyway, we have that connection, because you went to Caledonia also, correct?
I did.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. Oh yeah, there's so this is just, again, this book is something that is coming out in a couple weeks from Active Sports. They're a small publisher. They publish a lot of religious books, and then they have a sports line, including the Bill James Handbook each fall comes out from Active Sports. So I through some business contacts, I got put in touch with them. Really glad to have gotten some of the endorsement quotes I got, including Roy Firestone and Joe Bertmansky and others. Kurt and I also share the same publicity agent, so his new book and my new book, working with the same people to get it out there and publicize it more. So this is just what the cover looks like when it will be coming out soon. A little bit about the project. In my mind, at the time, I started working on this when I was about 10 years old. 1983, Rochester winters, not much to do during the hot stove during the winter time. I was always fascinated by picking all-time teams, whether it's the greatest teams of all time, American League, National League, the different franchises. So I would start taking notes. I had one of those old, baseball encyclopedias before the internet. I would pour through that, and it got ratty over the years. I started writing this book in 1999, so it's almost been 20 years in the process. Had a lot of life changes and job changes and things, so it was sort of an up and down, start and stop process. And now it's finally coming out this year. I'm 45 years old, and I'm just glad that this first baseball book that I'll write is finally coming out. I do plan on writing more baseball books afterward, and they won't take 20 years. So the next ones are probably going to take 2 or 3 years each. It ended up being over 600 pages, and you'll see why. It's a bit longer than I had planned it to be, but there's a lot of statistical tables and a lot of writing that went into it. As Ryan said, it's going to be available at Barnes & Noble. I'm really pleased. I'm a first-time baseball book author, but they've already ordered a bunch for the Barnes & Noble store, so that was great to see. What's in the book? So the reason I'm using PowerPoint slides, I'm used to presenting with PowerPoint slides at corporate conferences, but I want to show you visually, since I don't have the book to give out, some of the elements of it, because it's a multifaceted book and there's some visual aspects to it. But just to break down sort of what the book covers, I went through statistically and through the awards players won and so on, and chose fairly robust 30-man rosters for each of the franchises. So when I say a franchise, I mean that spans the whole history of the franchises, right? So for the Orioles, that includes their time as the St. Louis Browns. For the Dodgers, it goes back and includes Brooklyn and so on. For the Twins, that includes their time as one of the Washington Senators teams. So it goes back to the 1800s and includes the whole history of each case. I started with wins above replacement, right? One of those new sabermetric stats, the one that sort of gained the most popularity. Early on, when I was writing the book in the 1999 and around then, I also used Bill James's win shares, but then that didn't gain as popularity the way WAR did. And so, I start with WAR, but that I didn't want it to just be who's the highest wins above replacement stat. That anyone could just figure that out and look that up. So I then look at some other considerations, which we'll talk about. It includes starting lineups, which I'll show you as well, not just the rosters. Depth charts, everyone's familiar with those visuals of the players at their positions. And then one thing I did that other authors haven't done on this topic is I did a lot of research, including at the Cooperstown Hall of Fame Library and online, is I looked at all the other authors going back to the 40s that have written about this topic, that have chosen franchise-based all-time dream teams. And I compared my choices with theirs over the years, and also with fan surveys. Sporting News did a big fan survey across all the teams in 1969, so I included that. So you can see how over the decades, either authors or fan surveys have changed their view of who should be on these all-time dream teams. So that's another reason that the book ended up being over 600 pages. So again, what a franchise means, I explained that. It includes, changes in names, changes in location. The rosters, I broke it down so there's 16 position players, 2 for each position. I wasn't real strict with outfield, as you'll see if you read the book. I required that there be a true center fielder, but some of the all-time teams have 3 left fielders or 3 right fielders, different mix. I found it difficult to only choose 2 at each position, so I chose 2 extra just sort of floater players. On the Yankees, they've had so many good catchers. How can you only choose Berra and Dickey? And that leaves off Munson and Posada and Howard. I felt like I got to include one of those guys at least. 12 pitchers, mostly starting pitchers, because relief pitchers have only become a thing in the last several decades. So these rosters have a lot of starting pitchers and then a handful of relief pitchers chosen. I paid some interest in the managers. I selected the top 4 managers. But this is key. Other writers have looked at this, and they've, confusingly to me, they've looked at a player's entire career and used that as the justification for putting someone on an all-time team. Well, it's like, well, okay, Reggie Jackson played for several different teams. He's going to make the all-time athletics team, but his time with the Yankees shouldn't count as reason for that. It should just be what he did for the athletics, at least in my opinion. And same thing like Frank Robinson split his time with the Orioles and the Reds. So when I choose him for the all-time Orioles team, I'm only looking at what he did for the Orioles. Okay, that sort of thing. It means that some players don't make any of these all-time teams, even though they had really good careers, like Fred McGriff. He had a great career, but he spread it around a whole bunch of different teams, so he doesn't really make any. So like I said, I started with wins above replacement. I didn't just look at their total wins above replacement. I also looked at their peak wins above replacement stats. I also divided it by games played so you could get a sense of what their average production was over time. I did consider and talk about their traditional stats, because not everyone's into these newer fangled sabermetric stats. I looked at and considered how many times were they an all-star, how many times did they win the MVP or the Cy Young or the Rookie of the Year and things like that. And then also postseason performance, because WAR, of course, doesn't include anything postseason. So the fact that Yogi Berra was such an important player in the postseason, was part of the consideration as well. A little bit harder to see here, but I wanted to just show a couple of the sort of stat tables that are in the book. So I chose Yankees first base just to make a couple of points. So here you see Lou Gehrig and his lifetime wins above replacement. Of course, his whole career was the Yankees, so this is his whole career. 112.4. W3 is his top 3 seasons for wins above replacement. Obviously, he was very strong. And then his WAR score divided by his games played is this stat. as far as I know, these are things that other people haven't really developed or used anywhere, so it is something new in this book. You can see just how dominant Garrett was. I mean, he had a .0519 WAR divided by games, and Mattingly, who was a no slouch, was less than half that in terms of his value according to WAR per game played. And then there's some of the traditional stats that are average and home runs and stolen bases, again, just for their time on the Yankees. So this, just as an example, Garrett clearly the greatest first baseman for the Yankees ever. Mattingly I chose as the backup. Sort of interesting to see that Giambi on a per game basis was pretty much the same as Mattingly. But I mean, he only played for the Yankees 7 seasons, whereas Mattingly had 14. So obviously Mattingly should be the backup. This one, not real difficult, not real, few would argue with Garrett and Mattingly as the top choices there. In the book, I do talk about all these other players, though. I devote just a brief paragraph to each of them, talk about their highlights, and then move on. So for each position, for each franchise, there's a table like this. So there's basically 10 tables, because I do separate the starting pitchers and the relief pitchers. So 10 times 30, there's about 300 of these tables in the book. Here's an example of the pitchers one. Here, this is for the Braves. So you got Kid Nichols from the 1800s, Warren Spahn, Joe Niekro, and on down the list. I don't do wins above replacement divided by games pitched for the pitchers, because a lot of pitchers, particularly years ago, would split their time as a starter and a reliever, and that would mess up doing it on a per game basis. It you couldn't really compare the players. To understand that, you just do the math yourself, and you'll sort of see what I get at. So I show the total WAR. I show the top 3 seasons. Kid Nichols is very high, of course, because back in the 1800s they pitched 40, 50, 60 games as starters, so it's kind of exaggerated. The listing here isn't necessarily the order in which they're chosen for the team. This is just they're ranked by their total wins above replacement. To know how I rank them, you have to actually read the pros and see how I wrote about them. But this is just an example pitching stat table. Like I said, I went on then and chose for fun. I wanted to see what would some of the starting lineups look like. So here's the Red Sox, and I didn't want to just choose one lineup. I did against right-handers and against left-handers, and so that allowed me to think through like what platoons. These are all great stars and superstars. How could you possibly platoon the likes of Carl Yastrzemski and Jimmy Fox? Well, I mean, they are better against righties or lefties, so if you've got only superstars on your team, you'd end up platooning some of these guys. So for the Red Sox, for instance, there really wasn't someone to platoon with Trispeaker or Wade Boggs at third, but I've got Yastrzemski and Fox splitting time. I've got Ortiz and Rice at DH, Fisk and Veritek catching, and Hooper and Evans in right field. Second base was interesting for the Red Sox. It was really hard to choose one of them as the starter and one as the backup, and they're both right-handers, so I just list both Pedroia and Dor as potentially the starting lineups. Leaves a lot of great players, not listed here, Pesky and Petrocelli and Lynn. Those are the guys that would be on the bench. The depth chart's a little bit fuzzy, a little hard to see here, but again, each of the 30 chapters has one of these visual depth charts. And so this gives you a way to see what the all-time team, all 30 players would look like, spread out on the field. So here's the Pirates. Happens to be my favorite team. Pirates are interesting. Willie Stargell, everyone remembers him. Great player. He actually played more in left field than he did at first base. But for this project, I gave myself some flexibility. I said, well, he played a little more in left field than first base, but the Pirates were epically bad relative to their peers at first base historically. If I didn't have Stargell be the starting first baseman, you got Jake Beckley, who was admittedly a Hall of Famer from the 1800s, but he mostly played for other teams. And then there were guys like L.B. Fletcher and Gus Sir. They don't deserve to be on an all-time dream team, so I got to play Stargell at first base. And that was good because the Pirates were loaded in the outfield. Roberto Clemente, Paul Wainer, Max Carey, recently Andrew McCutcheon, Barry Bonds, Ralph Kiner. So they don't really need Stargell to represent them in the outfield. He can play first base. You can see here I've laid out, for the National League teams, some purists might not like it, but I I chose some DH possibilities there, just in case these dream teams were ever in a cornfield in Iowa and they're playing against, the all-time Yankees, there'd be a DH needed, so I think Ralph Kiner would have made a good DH, I think, for the all-time Pirates. So again, each chapter has one of these depth charts, which is kind of neat to see. My thinking in terms of readers of this book is that you'll want to read your favorite team's chapter, you'll want to read your nemesis teams, the ones you hate, their chapter, and then you'll probably just skim through the rest of the book. A lot of casual fans won't literally read all 600 pages, but having the lineups and the depth charts makes it interesting for people to quickly learn about all the other teams. So as I said, I did an analysis and a lot of research on other authors and fan surveys, and these are just some of the things that I found over the years. There were some books in the 1940s where authors would choose an all-time dream team, usually for just their favorite team. There was an author of the Cubs, the White Sox, I think the Yankees in the 40s. And Sport Magazine did a series in the late 1950s, and issue after issue they picked one team, and they did a write-up, just a page long or so, where they would choose the all-time dream team up until that point for that team. Now back then there were only 16 teams in Major League Baseball, so it went on for 16 months. And like I said, in '69, Major League Baseball commissioned a fan survey, and that covered all the teams. That was an interesting set of results. There was a book I loved as a kid. It first came out in 1984-85, and then it was reprinted and updated in '92. That was something I poured over in the '80s. Rob Nyer had probably the most comprehensive look at all-time dream teams up until that point in 2003, and he had some other interesting features in his book, the Big Book of Baseball Lineups. So that was a lot of fun about 15 years ago. And then, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, I think it's Phil Pepe. There's a series of books where he would co-write with Whitey Ford and Gary Matthews and Lance Parrish, one player who was prominent with each of these teams, and he wrote 8 or 10 books for those former players. And those are interesting. There is a lot of nostalgia in the writing, and there's some obvious, the players would choose the people that they knew best, that they had played with, and they would ignore some of the older players. But those are great reads as well. And many more. I mean, there's lots of authors, lots of fan surveys over the years. I poured through old game programs, like there was a Baltimore Orioles program from like the 70s or yearbook or something that had an all-time dream team for the Orioles, so I found that. There's probably plenty that I missed, but there's a good number. The bibliography is several pages long for these things. A couple of last features that the book has at the end of each chapter. I wanted to recognize the best seasons according to wins above replacement for each franchise. So here's a couple of examples of that. So from a hitters and defensively standpoint, the Orioles and Browns, these are the seasons for Orioles and Browns players that had an 8 or higher win above replacement. So Ripken had the 2 top seasons in '91 and '84, and you see on down the list there. It's interesting to do this because someone like George Stone, an early player from 1906, he didn't really play for the Browns for that long, but he had this standout season in 1906. So I barely mentioned him in this chapter, and yet here he is in this table as having one of the franchise's best offensive seasons. And then on the pitcher side, I gave the Cardinals here as an example. Bob Gibson clearly had those few years of dominance, a great career, but those 3 seasons were just incredible, the best ever. And then, Cy Young didn't mostly play for the Cardinals, but he did have a great 1899 season for them, so that was interesting to see pop up in a chart like that. So again, there's these tables. In some cases, they're long. The Yankees had a lot of great offensive seasons, so the table runs for a very long time. Other tables are pretty short, like you can imagine how short the Colorado Rockies pitching table is. How many great statistical pitching seasons have the Rockies had? Like 2, right? To help the expansion era teams, I do lower the threshold down to 7, because some of them they haven't had long enough history to have a lot of great seasons. So those are some fun things at the end of each chapter. And then at the very end of each chapter, and I've got a little handout here, my wife will just hand this around, it's a little thing you can take home and ponder. I chose a franchise player, so a best player for each franchise, which in some cases is easy and obvious. George Brett for the Royals, or Tony Gwynn for the Padres, right? And I created, these are little things I created myself, these silhouettes. And they appear at the beginning of each chapter, and then at the end there's a little paragraph about why I'm choosing this person as the franchise player. But it's kind of a fun exercise, and Ryan did this before when we got here early today. Can you identify, just based on these silhouettes, who each of these 30 players are? Not easy to do. Some batting styles or pitching windups are more easily identifiable than others. The answer key is on the bottom of the back side, in case you get stumped with something. I think Ryan, I didn't count, but you got like 25 out of the 30, which is incredible. Really, really good. Even other serious fans, I wouldn't expect to get more than 10 or 15. Yeah, and a lot of people are fans of just one team, so they might only get a couple.
Oh, you're right.
Not easy to do, but it's a fun exercise. A couple of last things I'll mention about the project. I hoped to get the book out in September of this year, but we had some delays on the cover and then other things in the publishing process. I'm sure, Kurt, you know all about...
So you're going to wait until next spring?
No, it's coming out now.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it is coming out now. It's at the printer now, and if you go on Amazon, yeah, it's hitting Christmas, absolutely. It'll be I'm hoping it'll be a good gift book for people.
You talked to Adam about this?
Oh yeah. No, he's on top of it. In fact, I just edited the press release, so the press release is probably going out Monday. But the delay allowed me to update it to include the 2018 regular season. And in doing that, that was an interesting exercise. These are the changes that I made that I felt were justified based on this last season. So Jacob deGrom, we all know, had a great year. Really hard luck season in terms of winning for the Mets. But he had great stats, and at that point, he had done enough, I felt, for the Mets to make it onto the Mets all-time team. Armando Benitez had a few good years as a reliever, but he drops off the team, replaced by deGrom. Nelson Cruz has continues to hit home runs consistently for the Mariners, so he replaces Phil Bradley. Edwin Diaz had a great year as a relief pitcher this year for the Mariners. So the workhorse pitcher Mike Moore from the A's, who lost a lot of games, but had pitched for them for a long time, he drops off the Mariners all-time team. And you can see the other ones here. Trevor Story, even though he's still pretty young and new for the Rockies, he's done enough for their short franchise history. This one's a little controversial. I mean, Max Scherzer, he keeps putting up outstanding seasons. He was already on the all-time Expos Nationals Dream Team in my view, but I moved him up a couple spots to be the second now. You could argue that based on his dominance, he should be considered their best pitcher ever. Steve Rogers had been there a really long time, so I still rate him first. But it's those kind of things that I think this book will just generate a lot of debate, discussion, argument, fun topic for everyone. Lastly, a couple things that I plan to write articles for, and working with Adam. I'm hoping that I can get these published either with ESPN or MLB.com or someplace prominent. If not, I'll just put them up on a blog somewhere. But it was interesting working on this all these years to think through what teams are really loaded at certain positions. I already mentioned the Yankees at catcher. They've had so many great catchers. Shortstop for the Pirates, Honus Wagner and Archie Vaughn, probably 2 of the 10 best shortstops ever. You think about second base for the Astros, the fact that they've only been around since the 60s, but they had Biggio, they had Altuve now, they had Joe Morgan late in his career, they had Bill Duran in the 80s, so that's pretty strong for an expansion era team. And then on the flip side, there's weak positions. The Pirates, as strong as the Yankees have been at catcher, the Pirates have had a 140-year history, and their best catchers are Jason Kendall and Tony Pena. And that's just not, they're good players, but they're just not of the caliber of Yogi Berra and Bill Dickey. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking down here, and when I was a little kid, Bobby Richardson was my hero. There's no way he's made him the best second baseman.
What's that?
For the Yankees.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So hardest decision for the Yankees.
Yeah.
I mean, you got Robinson Cano, Tony Lazzeri, Bobby Richardson, Joe Gordon, Gil McDougall, Willie Randolph. I mean, it's really tough. I ended up going with Cano and Lazzeri, but it's to just choose 2 out of those 6 is a tough thing.
Well, for the second edition, you can have Richardson.
Yeah, okay. I do plan to update this every couple of years. I mean, as you saw, 2018 alone had these changes. Every couple of years there'll be more changes. So. I mean, getting back to beat position, second base for the Braves. Oh, the Braves have been around, I mean, that franchise goes back to the 1800s. But I mean, Glenn Hubbard and Marcus Giles, I mean, that's just, relatively speaking, that's not what we want to see on an all-time team. No offense to those guys, I'm sure they're wonderful people, but really. Starting pitchers for the Rockies, obviously, not going to ever be strong. There were 38 players that I counted, maybe missed a couple, but 38 guys like Frank Robinson, you know, that make more than one all-time team. There were only 4 that make 3 all-time teams. Now, this is an important hint because it's easier to make an expansion era team than one with a 140-year history. There was only 1 hitter and 3 pitchers that, in my view, even with these large rosters, 30-man rosters, deserve to be on. Anyone care to guess who those 4 guys might be? What's that?
Nolan Ryan.
Nolan Ryan's one of them. Good. One of the pitchers. Yeah. Any other guesses?
Randy Johnson.
No, Johnson made 2.
Kurt Schilling?
No, he made at least 1, maybe 2. Raleigh Fingers, he spread his career around a little bit. This one would be some close calls, but Roger Clemens. Obviously the Red Sox, but then his short time on the Astros and the Blue Jays, he had those Cy Young seasons and was really dominant. And because those teams don't have long histories, it's easy to make a case for him to make it. And then the one hitter, you can discount some of his statistics if you think it used performance-enhancing drugs, perhaps. But Alex Rodriguez, because he had those great years for the Rangers, short-lived, and then both Mariners and Yankees. So no one makes it to 4, and I doubt anyone ever will. Hard decisions, like you said, Kurt. Second base for the Yankees is kind of tough. There's a lot of great players. First base for the Giants. The Dodgers was really interesting. Who's their best starting pitcher ever? Reflexively, you can say Sandy Koufax, but then if you think, wait, Clayton Kershaw is putting up some really good numbers, and they actually compare pretty well to Koufax.
Drysdale.
So
yeah.
Longer careers, you got Drysdale,
Yeah.
Sutton, Desi Vance.
Yeah, the Eclipse Koufax.
Yeah, for me it comes down to Koufax and Kershaw. I mean, at some point Kershaw.
You include the playoffs?
Yeah, I look at playoffs. I look at World Series. I considered all those things. But this is exactly, Kurt, your opinions on Koufax and on.
Well, I just think Drysdale,
Richardson.
I mean, he by far had, he had at least 50, 60 career victories more than Koufax.
Koufax did, yeah.
So Newcomb had more career victories than
Yep,
Koufax.
so you want to look at peak performance, you want to look at total time of the team, average value per game played, all these factors. And if you weigh one versus the other, I mean, if you just look at peak performance, then it's Koufax, or maybe Kershaw. But if you look at total value, time on the team, then it would, maybe it would be. And that's where people can have fun debating and talking these things. So one of the people that gave me an endorsement quote actually said, he's from Houston, and he said, for him the big debate is the all-time best center fielder for the Astros is it Jimmy Wynn or Cesar Cedeno. And I'm like, well, that's an interesting debate, but it's a little bit obscure for most people that aren't Houston fans.
Detroit fans.
Yeah, exactly.
What did you do with Roberto Alomar?
Yeah, he was spread around a bunch of teams too. So he makes the all-time Padres because they don't have a lot of options
The
there.
Indians?
There's the Indians. I considered him for the Indians. I considered him for the Blue Jays. So yeah, he was an interesting case. Yeah. Well, like I say, there were 38 people that made it on 2 teams, and they're not all as obvious and famous as Frank Robinson and people like that. So that's it. I just wanted to share. It's a multifaceted book. Something I've been working on a long time. My first book is hopefully made in the future. The website isn't really built yet, so it's a little premature to give out a URL. It'll just be to promote the book. But be available soon, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and elsewhere. Thanks for your time, everyone, and look forward to getting to know all of you better if I start coming to more and more of these meetings.
Thanks.